We're still here. The postponed election is the topic of conversation at this time, and Georgette was just sharing her thoughts before we went on that break. We're talking about chicken thighs and making me hungry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But no, it's the practical reality for many Nigerian people. Everybody had made adequate provision for, the following week, just in the unfortunate event that things weren't as peaceful as we would have hoped. And I think for many Nigerians who had traveled out, this is disheartening for two reasons. One, financially, and two, in relation to the Nigerian people's, fervor for our country. So there are two things that can happen, right? You can either have the Nigerian citizen who decides not to vote at all, A, because they can't afford to make the trip twice, or two, because they have completely given up on all hope that Nigeria would change just because of this postponement. Then the second thing that could happen is that you'd have Nigerians boiling with anger, such that they would decide to go to their polling booths, irrespective of whatever conditions they're in, just to make a change. And I feel like at this point, I would urge all Nigerians to exercise their right to vote. Your vote counts, it is important. And no matter how frustrated we all might be at this point in time, it's important that we all cast our vote.
Be angry, but go to the polls and express your anger there by voting for the candidate of your choice. That's the advice. Okay, before we go on to other issues from the postponement of the election, I want to just ask quickly, there's been calls for the resignation of INEC chairman, Monnou Yakubu. One of them is a popular presidential candidate among even scholars. I was watching analysis on television and I saw people angrily saying INEC chairman should step down because of this failure, not only apologizing. Let's not go to the issue of apologizing. We actually treated that here in the studio yesterday. So I'll just ask you, does it make sense at this point, just 1 week to the election, to be asking for the resignation of the INEC chairman on the issue of principle? That's the responsible thing to do.
In my view, it makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense.
I agree.
Because if the INEC chairman resigns now, first and foremost is the president that appoints an acting chairman of INEC. So automatically, that whole process is going to be subject to questions as to the integrity of INEC, the independence of INEC. Secondly, while I share with the frustration of many Nigerians as to the postponement of these elections, we also have to realize that the blame is not solely on INEC. You would remember that when INEC submitted their request for funds, it took such a long time for it to pass through the House, the two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So first and foremost, even the funding did not get to them on time. Secondly, the logistical issues that arose, yes, there are issues that they should have planned for and the like. However, it was clear to everyone there were burnings this week. There were logistical issues this week. And yesterday, speaking on the phone, and which is verifiable, the INEC chairman as well as certain commissioners even slept at the airports, trying their very best to make sure that.
Yeah, but some would say
it's not a pass. I'm not giving them a pass. Don't get me wrong at all. I'm not giving them a pass. I think it's unfortunate. I think it's terrible. However, I think that in light of ensuring that these elections are conducted in the freest and fairest manner in the circumstances, right? It's not going to be ideal to have Monnou Yakubu resign a week to the elections. That'll lead to a lot
I guess you share the same thought.
I do. Sure. And even for me as well, just from a structuring standpoint, you have an INEC chairman that is very well aware of what the issues are, what the logistical issues are, has the team in place that have supposedly plans in place to try and deal with this, the issues of getting the voting materials to the requisite state. So bringing someone new now to try and get a grasp on what the issue is first and foremost before you then think of implementing the plans, it doesn't.
Should he maybe resign afterwards then?
Yeah,
they could do that.
All right. How do we avoid situations like this? You rightly noted earlier that we've planned for years, over 4 years for this. We've had state elections, staggered elections, to use the latest word in our vocabulary now. How can we avoid situation of postponement of election in the future, because it seems to be a recurring decimal?
Absolutely.
I mean, if I could. Or do you want to?
Okay, Georgette, go, you go.
I mean, I think there are three things at play. One, I feel like INEC actually do try their best to have all the plans in place during the 4-year period. Mitchell already alluded to the first issue, which is about access to funds. So I think the Senate needs to do a better job in ensuring that, you know, the amounts of monies that they need are released to them as early as possible. That's one. But two, in relation to the implementation plan, INEC, you need to do better in terms of logistical planning, in terms of having your plan A, D, C, and F, like I mentioned earlier. But more than that, we also have to bear in mind the Nigerian factor. And the Nigerian factor is that you have, for example, people that are burning, you know, our...
Can we talk about this Nigerian factor for a moment before we go further? Because when we talk about serious issues, we talk about the Nigerian factor.
Yes.
Can we do away with the Nigerian factor that has that negative connotation of delays and excuses, and just think of how we can get around issues?
I mean, for me, when I say the Nigerian factor, I don't use it as an excuse. I use it as an awareness of what the problem is, right? And the thing is, the Nigerian factor can change on a 4-year rotational basis, election per election. This time around, there was issues in relation to Anambra fires and other state fires that completely removed, you know, the polling machines and, you know, voting machines. And that is even a huge problem. One, because you have to ensure that you have a backup, which INEC apparently do have in stock of these machines, because it's not easy to get. You have to then get them programmed, which takes time. You then have to get them transported to the states in question. And that's not even the last issue. The issue is about dissemination on ground. So one, we need helicopters. We need cars, we need planes, we need ships, we need whatever we need to get to be able to get that done. That's from an INEC structural perspective, yes. And when you're aware of the fact that, okay, every 4 years, something is going to happen, right? They have to also brainstorm internally and think of all the different issues that could potentially happen and how to solve them. But more than anything, I think the postponement is annoying. But if for any reason, Felicity, which I think is the most important, we had the elections take place yesterday, and for whatever reason, some people were not able to vote, people were disenfranchised in certain areas, I can bet you whichever party loses will definitely bring it up. We'll end up in court. The person that's supposed to be our president, you know, is not validly, elected, and will end up in a legal debate, which, you know, our court systems, although the Electoral Commission tries their very best, you know, to try and fast track these cases, we would still not have a supposedly finality on our president, which I don't think is wise. So if INEC, in their honest assumption, believe that it is best to delay for a week, let's give them the week. Sort this out, and let's have good and fair elections.
I think one important thing that we also have to realize is that you cannot take INEC out of Nigeria. So there are a lot of things. I'm sure you've flown several times where your flight is supposed to be at 7 a.m. and it's delayed till 9 a.m., 10 a.m., sometimes even till midnight from 7 a.m. The same things apply, because INEC is working within a system that has difficulties.
Of course.
So from the excuses that they put forward, it was that, okay, you know, planes couldn't take off because of the weather, things of that nature. Those are things that are outside the control of INEC. However, contingency planning.
Yes.
All over the world, there are contingency plans put in place for issues like this. And I think one of the most annoying aspects of it is that 3 days to the election, these issues were there.
Clear.
An hour to the announcement, Daily Post had published that, you know, they had gotten in contact with some high-ranking members of INEC who had said that, no, it's not going to be postponed that night. So it's not something that you found out an hour to the time that, oh, we cannot do this. It's the same way with your tailor. You have a wedding on Saturday or Friday. How far? Oh, madam, you'll be ready tomorrow morning. And tomorrow morning you get there and like, oh, I'm just starting. And next thing they start giving you an attitude. It's the same thing. They had to force the man to apologize to Nigerians, because at first, the first note had no apology. There's no regard for Nigerian time. There's no regard for Nigerian business. There's no regard even for value of due process and ensuring that things are done properly. And I think that's a referendum that has to be had on Nigeria. We have to demand more from Nigeria. We have to demand more from the services. We have to demand more from each and every commission in the country. Because it's the same way that you would not get your passport on time when you're supposed to have it.
Same issue.
It's the same way that you wouldn't get your license on time when you're supposed to have it.
Same issue.
It's the same way every single thing works. That snail pace, we need to take it out. I had an issue with, and I wouldn't name the commission now, it's a government parastatal, and we're dealing with a third-party client, and, we had a deadline for a certain day. And, we had asked them that, this is the deadline, and the day after we called them that, you said you were going to get it to us yesterday, and they were like, yesterday was the deadline, it's still fine. And I'm like, what? How do you wrap your head around this? And that's the type of mentality that needs to be sorted out. If other people are willing to spend their night, sleep over, ensure that certain things are done, the very least that you demand is that every other person pulls their own weight and ensures that this goes through. So I think it's very, very, very high-handed of the government to come out and say, oh, INEC, we gave you everything. No, you did not give them everything, because I would have expected that Air Force helicopters, Air Force planes, everything will be on hand, ensuring that these materials get to the right places.
Well, they did. You also identified some of the challenges that they went through. You've also proffered some suggestions as to proper planning going forward. So we
had 4 years, one job.
So we learned
one job every 4 years. How do you
during the press conference yesterday, the INEC chairman did say he hoped that this would be the last time elections would be postponed.
Well,
in
he
this
wouldn't
country.
be
But
chairman then.
He might not be chairman then, so who knows? That person might also say, we hope. I'm just optimistic.
We bank too much on hope, don't you think, Felicity?
Yeah, we this country.
But that's the beautiful thing about Nigerian people. I think if we didn't have hope, I don't know what we would be. I don't know where we would be as a people.
Okay, let's take this conversation a little further and just look at the issue of the minimum wage that's before the National Assembly, and of course the 2019. We just mentioned it in the previous segment of this program. Now that this situation is like this, the National Assembly was supposed to reconvene on Tuesday to take a look at the minimum wage and also to take a look at the 2019 budget so they can, take action on it. What are the implications of this? What are the possible scenarios if these bills don't scale through before the elections?
Okay. Well, in my view, I think it's more of a storm in a teacup. It's really not that deep, in the sense that the Senate, the House, they can reconvene immediately, even after the governorship elections. Remember that this government is still in power till May 29th.
Yeah.
Right? If you recall, when Jonathan was supposed to hand over to Muhammadu Buhari, I think a day to the...
He had just passed.
He signed about 15 bills in one day. So a lot of this is just to stir up tensions. To my mind, it goes back to the same thing I was saying about how all the arms and everyone has to put hands on deck. If you know that this is important, if you know that the national minimum wage bill has to be passed, they would
ensure it's...
Ensure! I was going to use an expletive, but thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
They were going to, they're going to be able to reconvene and ensure that this is passed. Now, one important thing that we need to ask ourselves is, why is it that it's always at the last minute that they remember that they need to reconvene? I'm sure you would remember about 2-3 weeks ago when the Senate was supposed to have reconvened, they could not get a quorum. They could not get a quorum. So because of their own laziness, they now come and foist it on the fact that, because there were no elections on that day. Even if there were elections on that day, I'm sorry, it doesn't change anything. So as far as I'm concerned, INEC has also said that there is not going to be any campaigning, any form of campaigning throughout next week. So I do not see any reason why they cannot reconvene and ensure that these bills are passed, if they're to be passed.
Georgette, do you have confidence that INEC has enough funding? Because a lot of unexpected expenses have come up, and he was asked that, what if there is a postponement? Do you have enough funding? And it says they're not complaining. Do you have confidence in that statement?
I mean, I certainly do. I feel like, 219 billion naira was given to INEC to ensure that this election will happen this year, this month. And I feel like they have more than enough money to be able to deal with it. Because if I was thinking from a budget and planning perspective, you would always have a contingency budget. There would always be money that must be put aside for emergencies. And I don't think that they've eaten their way through it. From what I understand, they had already backup voting machines, thumb printing machines, actually, that was lodged and ready to be distributed. The question was just how do we distribute it? So the logistical nightmare was really what they were trying to curtail within the last 48 hours just before the elections, and unfortunately they felt it best to postpone. They have a week. They have a long week to give themselves time to be able to ensure that they get all the adequate materials to the places that they need to get to ensure that we have safe, free and fair elections by Saturday. I feel like if INEC were actually to decide to postpone the elections one more time, it would be an international problem. Because you have the US, you have America, the US and the UK, for example, they've already made comments in relation to this election, talking about how Nigerian people should just remain calm and just remain confident in the fact that, this election will hold next week, and to implore that INEC do all things possible to ensure that it is actually held next week. I mean, Nigeria shouldn't actually look like the laughing stock of Africa, which currently is what we look like.
Unfortunately. But some people have argued that should we be more worried about what the international community is thinking, or be more concerned about the credibility of the elections that we plan to have? Because if we fail, they're still going to have a good laugh at our expense. So why don't we take our time, allow them giggle for a bit, and still, perform optimally, so nobody comes up and say, okay, you failed again.
Unfortunately, I think that they're interlinked to the extent that it's almost like school. You have your continuous assessment. You can fail your continuous assessment, but if you ensure that in the exam you make it up, it's fine at the end of the day. But it doesn't mean that when you fail your continuous assessment,
it's not a failure,
there shouldn't be some hard sticks applied. And I think that's the situation now. So yes, they can redeem themselves, absolutely. However, one thing I wanted to bring up, and back to the budgeting and whether they had enough money, is the fact that INEC budgeted the money that they required. 1. 2, INEC requested that money. They were given that money. And I don't understand why youth corps members who were the ad hoc staff...
Yes, I was going to come to that,
get to that.
So I feel that sometimes, even in terms of budgeting, this just shows that clearly, either some people were scraping off some money that was meant for some things on there, or clearly maybe they don't even have their budgeting right. And therefore, we may not be as confident that they have as much money that they need.
That question was put to the INEC chairman during the conference yesterday. Did you watch it?
Yes, I did.
What do you make of his response? Because there's been pictures circulating on social media, very pathetic looking pictures. Celebrities are coming up to say, oh, come, I will provide accommodation if INEC does not do so. Were you satisfied with his response? And he's talking about the monetary aspect of it. Maybe there is some logistic issue that they should have addressed. But these are supposed to be people that are volunteering to serve the country. Just let's hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, I'm thoroughly disappointed. I wasn't confident in his response either yesterday, and to be frankly honest, it's appalling. You cannot have people who are volunteering to be able to serve their nation, and you put them in such deplorable conditions. It makes no sense to me, and it just goes back to what Mitchell said. It's either one of two things. It's either you didn't budget for it, which to me is actually scary, because what that means is that you have no regard for the human being, or 2, there was money budgeted for it, but somebody somewhere put some money in some other person's
Who is this
pocket.
person? Because the INEC chairman, when asked, do you have confidence in your team? And he said, so far, there's been no evidence for him to think
but of
otherwise.
Course he would say that.
Who would be stealing and not? Is there not an accounting process? Like you do something, you give account for it, for this to happen? And it's so glaring.
I mean, for example, this is the same thing you could say about Nigeria's budget. That's the same thing. You could use the same metaphor. I mean, we have, for example, maybe 45 billion naira for gardening in the presidential villa. And I would ask you, what would we use 45 billion naira for gardening? So, I mean, there's so many ways that people can get away with siphoning of funds without anybody either choosing to raise an eyebrow or completely turning a blind eye. And that, for me, is what is most concerning.
Well, what would the NYSC, the management of NYSC, what do you think their role is in this? Seeing the situation that corps members who left their home, gone to a different part of this country, trying to serve their country, is being treated, and they're saddled with the responsibility. Yes, they're ad hoc staff for INEC, but they are also the primary responsibility of the National Youth Service Corps.
I mean, I think the National Youth Service, DG, I believe it is, needs to actually put their foot down and make a statement, and actually to force INEC and force their hand in order to ensure that provision is made for them, and to let people know that you can't use youth corps members in that way. I mean, I don't want to speak from a personal perspective, but most people who have served their nation have been lucky to be able to do that, will say that our camps are not the nicest of camps. And I didn't serve in Lagos, I served in another state altogether. And I can say to you that I literally came back a stick, just because of the kind of conditions that we were in. You couldn't use bathrooms, there were no toilets, no bathrooms to use. I'm not even going to get into the details of what had to be done in order to ensure that, one could survive. The point is this: we need to do better as a country. We need to do better as a country. I think we have too much money circulating, right? That we have no excuse at this point in time to continue to allow these sort of conditions continue. Every celebrity you can think of was talking about it yesterday. These poor youth corps members were sleeping in buses, sleeping on the floor, on the ground. Like, how is that even okay? In any other country in the world, this would be an infringement of human rights. It's inhuman and degrading treatment.
All right, I'm being told we have very little time left, so I want us to take on the issue of overburdening of INEC. We got to hear from the press conference yesterday from the INEC chairman that we need to have a conversation about the responsibilities of INEC after the elections. What are your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I think that conversation is long overdue, because we've had repeated instances of failures on the part of INEC. Even at the last election, although it was seen to be generally free and fair, you had issues even with ex-President Goodluck Jonathan not being able to use the card reader. So, we cannot continue, accepting substandard behavior. We cannot continue like this. And a more important conversation, I think, can be triggered from the Electoral Amendment Bill. It's almost divine now that it wasn't signed, because clearly there are things that need to be added into it to tighten it beyond just the conduct of elections, but also as to INEC's responsibility, one. Two, as to INEC's funding. I see no reason why INEC has to be subject to the whims of the presidency and the National Assembly every 4 years as an independent commission to determine how it gets its funding. We should think of ways how INEC can internally generate their revenue. We should think of ways how even voting, why do I have to travel all the way to get to a polling unit when all over the world people can even vote from outside the country? So these are the things we need to start thinking about, and I think it goes back to those who make our policies. Are we willing to continue with analog policies when the world is moving digital? Or are we willing to now have those real conversations and demand for the best for our country? Because, in a few short years, a lot of these people would have, they're
Georgette,
old.
Do you see that conversation happening? Because this is not the first time we've had that INEC needs, there's need for a conversation. And then you also mentioned the electoral bill that's still
pending.
Not signed. I see us having a serious conversation?
To be honest, I'm not optimistic. And I'm not optimistic because the only reason the time that we end up having these sort of conversations is always every 4 years when elections are coming up. And when we start realizing that, okay, we're going to have people at polling booths, voting in a very short few months. And that's when we start having these conversations. And I feel like the onus now would be on the INEC chairman, if he stays, remains as INEC chairman. The onus would now be on whoever we vote into the presidency to actually see this as a real issue and have the foresight enough to realize that these conversations need to be had. The electoral bill needs to be looked at again, tightened, like Mitchell mentioned, in order to ensure that at the next 4-year juncture, INEC is probably in a better position logistically, in terms of funding, in terms of planning, to be able to ensure this sort of issue doesn't happen.
All right, before we go, your thoughts, what would you say to Nigerians who might be hesitant as a result of the postponement of the election to come out again on Saturday? And maybe chip in a word for those who traveled all the way from somewhere in the world just to be a part of the electoral process.
Well, I'll say, first and foremost, keep calm. Secondly, you know, I think as one of the presidential candidates said, you can postpone an election, but you can't postpone destiny. So, you know, go out there, exercise your civic duties, and, you know, it's for Nigeria's sake. So the fact that things have been set up against you does not mean that we cannot succeed despite the issues rather than because of it.
I mean, I agree with Mitchell. I think the story of the Nigerian populace actually is one that against the odds, we always find a way to sail through. And I feel that as a Nigerian person, please go and exercise your right to vote. It is so important. The anger that you might have welling within you, I pray for peace. And I also ask that you use that anger and channel it towards ensuring that you vote.
That's where we're going to wrap it. Please go out and vote. The conversation continues. You need more information, you'll get it right here in our election studios on Plus TV Africa. We'll be right back.